Yeah. My name is Marco Rossi. I'm the Director of Standardization at ISO Central Secretariat. And welcome to the Standards Pavilion. As you know, international standards are a vital tool to accelerate the transition toward a sustainable world, and in particular, a net zero world. And at ISO, we believe in all voices heard. That is why we animate a community of 170 plus members across the world. But not only that, we believe in the engagement of partners and initiatives beyond our membership. That is why we build this Standards Pavilion, which is not just an ISO pavilion, it's a Standards Pavilion. And we believe in the convergence, collaboration, harmonization of standards worldwide. So we are here to talk about net zero and what is more central to climate action than net zero. So with that, please enjoy this panel. Thank you for being here, and I'll leave it to our moderator, Emily.
Thank you so much, Marco, for that introduction. Can I check that everyone in the pavilion can hear me okay? Wonderful. So good afternoon to all of you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are joining us online. It's fantastic to have such a full and busy and interested group join us here today at COP29 in Baku, and I am delighted to have the panel that we have today who will speak to the importance of international standards for an equitable net zero future from a range of perspectives, from policymakers, business, investors, and of course the international standard system itself. This session today is going to talk about the role of this system. We're going to talk about two international standards in particular that are under development right now, which we will be explaining to you their importance, their relevance, and how you can get involved to support an equitable net zero transition. And we will also be hearing from these different stakeholders on stage about how it will help deliver against their objectives. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our expert panel. Starting at the very end, we have the wonderful Daniel Trillos, who is the Deputy Director of Standardization at ICONTEC, Colombia's national standards body. He is also the Vice Chair of ISO's Environmental Management Committee, and most relevantly to today's proceedings, he is also the co-convener of the ISO Net Zero Standard. So thank you for joining us today, Daniel. Moving along, we have the wonderful Valentina Ramirez, the Head of Climate Strategy Implementation for the Institutional Investors Group of Climate Change. We have Mathilde Mesnard from the OECD, the Deputy Director of the Environment Director at OECD. And last but certainly not least, we have Alexander Nick, Senior Director of Climate Action at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today for this discussion. So to set the scene and really make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean by international standards, I want to turn first to you, Daniel. As mentioned in the opening remarks, you have extensive experience in the international standard system, over 15 years working in international standards on environmental management, and you are also the co-convener of the ISO Net Zero Standard, which for those of you who don't know, was announced back in June this year and is currently under development with an aim to launch by COP30 next year. To make sure we're on the same page about what international standards are, Daniel, can you explain to us what do we actually mean by international standards, and what is the international process for developing an international standard in ISO?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, about the process of the international standards, what we usually do is that we are a network of national standards body. This is a member-based organizations in which there's the members who decide what is into the document. And what we do usually is that each national standards body appoint their experts to participate in the process. Those experts meet together, and through consensus, they establish the requirements, what is in that document. In general, those documents, those standards, are tools to do the right thing, and that's what usually we have in there. And the process that we follow is an iterative process going back to the countries, to the national standards bodies, to express their points of view, their positions, their requirements, and that goes again through the consensus to those processes until the document is mature enough and is ready to be published as an international standard. That's what usually happens in that process, in which I would like to highlight also that it is a process very inclusive where all voices are heard and there's participation from developed and developing countries, and each country and each national standards body has the same power to decide on the content of the document. It could be the strongest economy or the weakest one that participate in the process, and that makes the standard very impactful. And then you have a document that is being, and it's possible to be applied by developed or developing countries and organizations from any kind, and that's something very important in that process. And for example, just to go in a particular example, one document that was developed around environmental management that was ISO 14001, and it was launched in 1996, I think. I don't remember exactly the date. But one of the things is that then the document is being implemented, it's being used, it's been certified. We have almost 500,000 certifications around the world. But then the experience that happens with that implementation of the document goes again to the technical committee to be revised. And then that experience of that implementation goes again into the document and gets the document even more impactful, more powerful, because gets all the experience then from different economies, from the different countries, from the different stakeholders, and go into the revision process. And that goes and goes, and that's something very important for the continual improvement of the documents to reflect the best practices, what is in there. That's basically the process that we follow.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I love the point that you made there about how each national standards body has the same power and its own voice. And again, the theme we're talking about today is not just a transition to net zero, but an equitable one. And too often we hear about problems of top-down governance or the decision-making that will affect the whole world being dominated by the voices of richer countries, of global north countries or higher income countries. And those over 170 national standards bodies that Marco referred to earlier all have the same voice in this system, and it is with the consensus of those groups that an international standard is made. Sort of with that in mind, Daniel, before we bring in the perspectives of our other panelists, can you give us your view on why the world needs trusted, recognized international standards developed in this way to support an equitable transition to net zero?
Yes, it is, as I was mentioning, the process where everybody is involved. When we talk about net zero again, we need everybody to be on board. It's not just a matter of some, and it's a matter of everyone. So we need that different voices to be heard in the process, to be involved in that, to be engaged in that. And that's what the national standards bodies are, and have that task also, to get their national positions and to bring that to the international stage to be expressed there. One good thing also in that, and I would like to mention a little bit of the process that we are following on that net zero standard that is being developed, is that we first came with net zero guidelines. Those guidelines came in 2022. We started that process. We produced those guidelines. But those guidelines has recommendations, and the document is about recommendations, and some organizations are already following those recommendations. We have some time ago, the General Motors was saying that they are following those guidelines. So it's very important that we have those guidelines, but then in the end we need also some requirements that organizations can express and can give reports and produce claims about their alignment with net zero, and that's what we are doing right now, producing those requirements so that organizations can demonstrate that they are following that, and that's one of the things that we are doing here. Something also very important, as I was saying before, on All Voices Heard, is that in the process we have a twin convenorship. That means that we have two persons, one from a developed country and one from a developing country, leading the process. I'm the one representing the developing countries in there, so that we have, again, all voices heard, involved in the process, and that the document would be useful for developed countries and developing countries also. We expect that the document would be launched in COP30, and that's the idea that we have, because we would like to work in that document as fast as possible, as the same as we did with the guidelines. We needed something quick for the market. Of course, not sacrificing the importance of the content for the speed that we need, but we need urgency. We have urgency in this when we need ambition, and that's something that we are working in there. And that would be something interesting that if you are not participating in the process, because in the end the process and the documents are done by all. Anyone can participate in that process. So it would be important that you contact your national standards body. You can go to ISO.org and there you can find the national standards bodies, contact the national standard body and get involved into the National Climate Committee or the National Environmental Management Committee and participate in the process, put your visions, your expertise and your positions in there to be represented in that document that we expect to produce. And in the end, that document is for the net zero aligned organizations, that's what we are expecting, so that organizations can demonstrate their alignment with the net zero commitment that we have.
Fantastic, thank you, Daniel. And speaking of joining committees and getting involved in the process, Alex, I'm going to turn to you. You are the Senior Director of Climate Action at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a global coalition of businesses working towards climate action and an organization that is participating in the development of the ISO net zero standard that Daniel discussed. From your perspective, what does the business world need to see from international standards like this one to help accelerate their net zero action and make it easier for them to take?
Thank you, Emily. Great to be here, and I wouldn't have thought of having a packed pavilion talking about standards, and not just this session, I think the full day and the other days to come as well. So excited to be here and talk about the relevance of international standards. I was in a corporate myself before, and yes, as you were mentioning, the ISO 14000, for example, or 9000, so they are really credible standards that everyone in business knows and follows. And so far, there was no one on net zero. So I think so we are highly in support for ISO to work on a net zero standard. As you were asking, Emily, so we are convening 250 multinational companies as members for WBCSD. And like what do they really seek? So we want, and our member companies want to ensure that standards, especially on net zero, but probably all of them, they are practical, so they need to be feasible to implement. They need to be science-based, and they also need to be aligned with the corporate needs to further accelerate climate action. So I think this is as ingoing, I think, what we would need to find out of any standard. If ISO, what we are now contributing to, is able to meet those, I would definitely say this is great, this is amazing. It needs to have a kind of level of ambition inbuilt as well. Because as much as I think most in the room probably love ISO standards, if they are not sufficiently supporting the transition to what is needed, and we also talk about the equity piece later on, it won't help. So what is now in the way, right? So I think we see from a business implementation perspective, we need much greater harmonization of standards to eliminate the confusion that is out there, to also reduce compliance burdens, and to then have really consistency in climate reporting. So if there are too many standards that are out there on an identical topic, so that leads to inefficiencies and to unnecessary complexities. And we already see, and probably many of you in this room know all those alphabet soups that we are all dealing with in the corporate climate action world, from ISSB to EFRAG to PRI to GRI to SASB, and then obviously also to ISO. And then we also have task forces on climate, on nature, on inequality. So what is the role, or what would we love to see, and especially if it's happening up to COP30, as you were saying, Marco, it's like how can ISO bring in clarity in this broader net zero ecosystem? How will it compare to existing standards, or how will be existing standards such as SBTi, where I think it's obvious many companies are relying on SBTi. They brought out their standards, they're working now also on a revision. How gets this integrated? Then there's a piece on validation, on verification. I think this is definitely what ISO would be able to bring in. Then there's a question, I was just talking to some other member companies earlier, saying yes, but is it then also sector specific? So probably this one first will be more sector agnostic. but what would then be the overriding framework to also make it sector specific? And what's in and what's out, like is, for example, voluntary carbon markets, environmental attribute certificates, is it part of it? Is it not part of it? So those are some of the things where many of our member companies are asking for. So they want to get engaged. So I think they learned they can do it through a national point of contact. Also thanks to you, WBCSD joined as a liaison delegate. So we are also listening, observing, and also sharing according to the terms of reference with our member companies, and then also bring in input. But at the end of the day, it's a national chapters of ISO where there's a voting rights. So I encourage all the companies in the room to go to the national point of contact and to get engaged there.
I think it's a real testament to how much this ecosystem is converging and collaborating, that you were just so perfectly reciting all of the ISO terms of references and processes there, Alex. And I think it made it even more evident why it's so important, as you say, that this system works with all of the other standard setters who have made so much progress and galvanized so much momentum in the market, such as the ones you've referenced there, and why they too have joined the ISO system as liaison organizations to participate along with that fantastic ecosystem of countries from around the world that Daniel was describing. You've brought out lots of topics there which we are going to delve into, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But we want to also acknowledge that this is not all just about companies, it's about finance. We are, of course, at, as they admittedly are all labeled, another finance COP. And so Valentina, I want to bring you in from that investor perspective. You have done an enormous amount of work in IIGCC about working with investors, and trust and integrity is a huge part of building investor confidence to help us unlock and move that capital that everyone is so urgently calling for to facilitate the transition and make the actual action that will be set out in standards like the ISO Net Zero standard doable and achievable, particularly in the context of a just transition. How do you envisage the development of international standards like this and enhancing trust for investors? Because of course, IIGCC is involved in a parallel ISO standard specifically for financial institutions, the ISO Transition Finance Standard that will build on the great work of initiatives such as GFANZ, the Transition Plan Task Force, IFRS and others. How do you see these developments in unlocking action from investors and building confidence?
Yeah, so just to provide a bit of more context on the net zero investment framework, that is, as you say, a framework at the investor level, so perhaps one level removed versus vis-a-vis corporate standards. So the net zero investment framework was developed in 2019-2020 by a group of highly committed investment practitioners. And they really were thinking on how to create a framework to pull the levers that investors had to reach the Paris Agreement goals. And building on what you were saying, it being a co-production or co-produced with practitioners, and also from what Alex was mentioning, it had a good balance between achieving climate ambition, reaching the Paris goals was the ultimate aim, but also remain applicable. So we like to think about the net zero investment framework as a collection of good ideas, as a collection of best practice, if you want to change the social norms of investing. So we do favor perhaps general level recommendations over particularly granular prescriptive recommendations, and we can delve into that in a second. But just to bring about some of the lessons learned, I guess, from the first iteration to the second iteration of the net zero investment framework, we were thinking and building on this level of over prescriptiveness and how much to actually give in a standard or not, is the idea of unintended consequences. So we realized in the second iteration that an overly prescriptive approach to decarbonization targets would bring unintended consequences, such as the paper decarbonization incentives, meaning that then investors would decarbonize the portfolio through portfolio allocation rather than engaging with companies to change corporate practices, which was the ultimate aim. And actually speaking about equity and fairness, these also had the unintended consequence of perhaps divesting or shifting away from emerging markets who in general have higher production-based emissions profiles. So in this second iteration, we really wanted to address these issues, and we stated or kind of converted rather those targets into two high-level objectives, one being real-world decarbonization, so pulling the lever on the engagement element with the companies a little bit much more, and then the second objective being a shift of focus or a shift of flows to climate solution investments, some of which actually would have higher emissions, perhaps even in the long term. So I guess the invitation here, and I can delve into it with more detail in a minute, is to think about the potential consequences and bringing the practitioner's view and thinking ahead on those prescriptive approaches. Ultimately, because the transition is going to happen in different ways, and as we're speaking, this is a constantly shifting matter. So what we think we know, we actually might not know a couple of months when the data is constantly changing. Of course, it needs to remain decision useful, but just being mindful of that over prescriptiveness, and more ideas on that on the policy side to share later. But I'll stop there for now.
And I think, and these are really interesting points, and I think we're really starting to lift the lid now on some of the real complexity and the debates that are raging in the international consensus process. I'm seeing a smile from Daniel there, who knows these debates well. And I think, Valentina, you're unlocking, again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. And we need a nuanced discussion and a nuanced set of rules that can support different actors with different needs in this transition. And queuing you up soon, Matilda, on the policymaker perspective. Valentina, I want to ask you one more question building on those points about that balance. When it comes to how international standards can inform emerging policy and regulation around the world, how do you think international standards can strike that right balance between prescriptive but also having proper safeguards to help policymakers take the critically urgent decisions that we all know they need to take?
Yeah, so I guess the first point to make is the stating the obvious, right? Is the emphasis on transparency and disclosure and how that facilitates consistency and accountability, with which be more on the regulators and policymaking side. Not only on the real financial actors or the subjects of the standard, but actually on other actors in the ecosystem. So for example, from the perspective of the investment side, it's not just the companies or the investors, it's also the service providers and the whole ecosystem, index vendors, data providers, and how they can also be part of this conversation, and they can also be regulated or be subject to useful standards of best practice. So that's perhaps the most obvious point. I think another, and this brings a connection with the following points, but it's just standards have been already informing regulatory expectations. In fact, the OECD just released a report, and I was quite struck by the fact that actually financial policies now that incorporate climate elements have quadrupled, according to the report, since the Paris Agreement. So they are already informing that. If I'm allowed to restate on the prescriptiveness model, I guess one example at hand is the net zero benchmark regulation by the European Commission. This is the Paris-aligned benchmarks and the climate transition benchmark. Again, a one-size-fits-all rule of 7% decarbonization has led to the unintended consequences that I just mentioned before. Divestment, shifting away from emerging markets, and I think the practitioners had the chance to actually feedback to the regulator, the European Commission, and into how this could be affecting actually the much wider adoption of these. So the recommendation here is to focus rather on disclosures and transparency, avoiding that one-size-fits-all, which is the point we just made.
Thank you so much, Valentina. And as we warm you up, Matilda, to come in from the OECD perspective, you are the Deputy Director for the Environment Directorate at the OECD, which convenes member governments around the world to collaborate and support global economic cooperation. How important do you see the role of multilateral governance systems like the international standard system in taking into account these different nuanced needs that the panel has highlighted today to support a just and equitable net zero transition?
Well, if you look at go back at the Paris Agreement, basically it was a very high level commitment or goal, and then a lot of flexibility of how we achieve that. and you have the countries who have set up their NDCs and regularly reviewing them. But then it's really a bottom-up exercise with all the actors, the governments, the companies, the investors, etc., putting in some actions to drive the change. And they can be taxonomies, they can be regulations, guidance, different type of actions that are put in that. But how do you ensure that all these things together move the dial in an effective way, in an efficient way? Basically, it's not that certain that it's not.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not that certain that it works well and it works effectively, and so the fragmentation and that at the end the accumulation of all these actions lead to effective change and we ask where we want to be. So you need coordination, you need to drive interoperability across all these different actions, you need to harness the synergies across all these actions, and that's where international standard setting could be super important. And let me give you a couple of examples, of course, based on the OECD, what we do, because we are also an international standard setter. Of course, it's more like policy standards. It's a different type of standards, but these are standards, nevertheless. I give you one example that is very core to the topic of climate change and driving the transition there. We are currently working on enhancing cooperation and measuring the carbon intensity or the carbon footprint of products. This is absolutely key because it's an area where we see fragmentation in methodologies and fragmentation in reporting regimes. And this is super useful because it's linked to a lot of climate policies, including those that have trade impacts, such as the CBAM in Europe, or anything related to green project standards. So you need, if that's a very good example. You might have a policy like the CBAM, but how you implement it if you don't agree on how to measure carbon intensity, how you can implement it in an effective manner. So at the OECD, we do a lot of standards. We have, I mentioned in a previous panel, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, basically that set expectations from governments on companies, how they should deal with their impact in terms of environment, social, etc., and what kind of remedies they should put in place. Okay, does it work better?
Are we all good on sound?
So this typically, and these guidelines, we have revised them recently to make sure that they are incorporating all the climate dimension. And we have a lot of other standards that are important. For example, we have corporate governance standards, principles, that we have revised also to make sure that they integrate all the elements that are needed to drive the transformation.
And can you unpack a little bit more for us,
yeah,
for those who are not familiar with how this works? One of the key themes here has really been about multilateral governance and consensus building, and of course OECD convenes member governments. Can you explain a bit more about how in the development of these deliverables you've been able to draw on input and insights from the different members around the world to achieve that outcome?
Yeah, so the OECD, it's an intergovernmental organization. So the idea is to drive standards for government policies. So the idea is on one specific topic, and currently we are working on transition finance to phase out coal, for example. So in this case, we gather all the member governments and beyond, because we don't work only with OECD members for obvious reasons. And we exchange experience, what are the different countries are doing or not doing, etc. And we try to drive a consensus, to build up a consensus on what should be the do's and don'ts on one specific topic. And we need to reach a consensus, So of course our standards are not super specific, they are not very prescriptive at the technical level, it would be impossible. So what we have very often is like principle-based, like trying to agree on what should be the objective of the public policies, leaving a lot of flexibility for the different governments on how they would achieve these different objectives.
Thank you so much. And I want to bring it back to the business perspective for a moment, Alex. we've heard a lot, and indeed more broadly here at COP, there's a lot of conversation about how standard setters and those who provide guidance to business, or indeed, requirements to Matilda's point, need to consider harmonization, clarity, and to help businesses unlock action. But as we've mentioned on this panel, equity and consideration of a just transition is so important. WBCSD, with this global coalition of businesses that it has, is doing a lot of work on how equity can be built in at that organizational level. How do you think an equitable net zero transition should be considered at that organizational real economy level?
Well, that's a decisive question.
Yeah, a nice, easy question for you.
Just transition elements in standard development work needs to get integrated from the get-go. Because if we are just working first on especially if now there's an opportunity on a net zero standard, and if it doesn't have sufficient just transition elements, it would come separately, and then again to what we have said before, right? So then you need to work again on harmonization. So can we integrate it into existing standards, and can we, when we set up new standards, put it in from the get-go? We need that to create opportunities for corporates in emerging markets, in lower income countries, so that the net zero guidance incorporates the context and the priorities of the markets they operate in. Those companies require actionable guidance so that they can demonstrate that action. And this should have multiple impact dimensions, right? So you need to look at the workforce in the supply chains, at effective communities, consumer and customers, at nature elements. So we at WBCSD, we do a lot of work on climate, on nature, and on equity. And how may this look like, right? So if you're able, to your question, Amelie, if you're able to include equity just transition into a net zero standard, so it would help to support sustained access to products and services, so like essential needs like electricity, transportation, proteins. It's the impacts on jobs, so where jobs that are being created are often not the ones lost. And impacts, last but not least, obviously, impacts on communities and their resilience to also manage through shocks and stresses. So there are many dimensions we could go in, from disclosure to corporate transition plans, public financing, financial instruments. One piece I would like to highlight is the important work of the TISFD. So looking really on inequality-related financial disclosure, the systemic risks that relates out of them. And if we need to be really careful not to overdo it on metrics and standards for the standard's sake, but really that there, and I think you mentioned it, that any data that comes out is really decision useful. And it's already difficult for a net zero standard, and if we now want to build in equity just transition as part of it, it will be even more challenging. But if you're not doing it, we may lose really one of the main points of ensuring a just transition, and to really ensure to leave no one behind.
I think there's lots of homework for the hard-working leadership group of the ISO Net Zero Standard and the ISO Transition Finance Standard to take away from some of these insights there. And again, you've illustrated the complexity of how we build this into the right degree into international standards really well there, making sure that we are assertive enough and clear enough that it can help unlock action, but not so overly prescriptive that we tie organizations in knots and are unable to take decisions that they need to. So we've heard some of the gaps and some of the challenges from the business perspective. And I want to come back to you, Matilda, from the OECD perspective and the policymaker perspective. Now, OECD is a liaison itself, like WBCSD, into the development of the ISO Net Zero Standard. And I'd love to hear from you where the OECD, what you're hearing from your members, where do you see the remaining gaps in net zero guidance for organizations specifically to help unlock an equitable net zero transition? What gaps do you think these international standards under development, whether they be the transition finance for financial institutions or the net zero standard for organizations, what do you think they need to address to help policymakers take the decisions and the actions that they need to?
There is clearly, sorry, I don't hear myself to me. So there is clearly a gap when we look at for example, at the alignment of the financial sector. We just did a paper that I think you read that shows that in spite of all these policies that were developed in the last 10 years, since the Paris Agreement, the financial sector is broadly very misaligned yet. Is financing more unsustainable activities than sustainable activities when we can assess it. But there are many still blind spots in the financial sector where we have no clue, basically. So this is an area where we need much more clarity, when we need to have agreements on a couple of key, information, data gaps, and agreement on methodologies for the data gaps, so that we can really measure the impact of the policies that we are taking in the financial sector, to make sure that the financial sector is shifting for good, for real, towards financing the green, the sustainable, and stopping financing the unsustainable. So that's an area where we do need, I do think, a lot of standardization to drive, also to increase the credibility, etc. Another area is clearly on the transition plans per se, and we had a whole discussion on that just before, so I won't repeat it. This question I was mentioning before, carbon intensity of products. There we need an agreement on how you measure it. We need an agreement, otherwise a lot of climate policies won't be effective or won't be trusted, and there will be distrust, etc. You need and all this, enabling system of quality infrastructure to make sure that once you agree on a methodology, you have all the systems to verify, and so that it could be trusted. So that, these are three things that come to my mind.
And I think that is a brilliant word to bring out on and sort of touch on before we go to the audience for questions about trust. And you've mentioned a really important term there, Matilda, that I think often isn't heard enough about climate action forums like COP, which is quality infrastructure and that role of trusted verification. We've heard from Alex on the business perspective about the clarity needed, the importance of harmonization, making it less confusing, frankly, for businesses to take action and to know that what they're doing is considered credible and trusted. We heard from Daniel that feedback on the use from businesses like General Motors on things like the ISO net zero guidelines was really useful, making a clear business case for net zero, but they needed that verification element that only an international standard with requirements could offer. Before we go to questions from the audience, which is your cue to get ready with some, Matilda, could you close us out on the panel section of this session with unpacking for us what role the international standard system has in this quality infrastructure and how it supports policymakers such as those at the OECD to deliver on trusted climate action?
Well, if you can agree on standards, but if you don't have people that can certify that a specific actor or a specific government has really used the standard as it should do, it's difficult to implement it. It won't be trusted, it won't be used at the end, or it won't lead to what it needs to lead to. So I think it's an ecosystem, of people that can certify, people that can verify, people that can test things. If you have all this quality infrastructure ecosystem in place, then if you agree on the standard and if policymakers agrees on minimum policies or whatever, then it will be implemented because it will be trusted.
Absolutely, and I think a message maybe you didn't expect to learn at the Standards Pavilion is that standards alone are not enough to deliver trust. Yeah. And that actually you need standards working within that broader quality infrastructure system, that system, as you mentioned, Matilda, of verification, of accreditation, making sure that those who are doing the assurance, the verification function can be trusted to do so. And that system that needs to exist and does exist in some form in almost every country in the world is really critical to recognize and to mobilize for this equitable net zero transition. This point is energizing our panel so much. Before we go to questions, one more from you,
if
Valentina.
I'm just allowed to interject, perhaps a point to overstress on the gaps, on policymaking gaps, it's really to continue to price the externality or to actually go much farther than that. Because we often hear from members on the, how exhausted they are on data and standards and one and more metrics. And I guess the idea behind it has always been, if you are ahead of the curve of regulation, you're able to identify transition risk, you're able to identify physical risk. That's actually, a business case for you to be part of a standard and do the work. But we do need the regulator to grow like scarier teeth, I guess, so that the homework makes sense. So I think that gap is important, not only on the financial side, because financial actors are not the ones polluting, but actually on the real economy and fossil fuel subsidies and all of that is actually delaying the pricing, the externality, which is what we need so that all the business case of standards makes sense.
Absolutely, and that's what we're ultimately working towards. So I love that enthusiasm there. We'll come to you first. So just to sort of recap where we've come to now. So we've heard about the broader role of the international standard system, that system of convening countries to agree international standards that identify common solutions to shared problems, with net zero being an obvious example of that. We've heard about the existence of 2 relevant international standards being developed in the ISO system, the ISO net zero standard for organizations, and the ISO Transition Finance Standard to support transition planning for financial institutions, which all of the organizations represented on this panel are involved in through their committees. We've heard about some of the debates that are raging in these processes about that, how do you strike that balance of rigor, credibility, integrity, prescriptiveness, while being sure to avoid those unintended consequences that other standard setters have learned from, such as IIGCC, OECD, and others. We've heard about that urgent call, which I know we've all heard before, but really cannot be overstated, of the need for harmonization from businesses to make this easier and simpler to do. Because if we are not simplifying things, then arguably are we doing our job as standard setters? So, with all of those points in mind, I'd like to open up now to questions in the room for our panelists before we invite you to join us for a reception to start off your evening. So can I have hands up, and we'll try and fit as many in as possible. I said we would come to you first, and if you wouldn't mind just saying who you are and where you're from, that would be great.
Thank you so much for that. So Manveer Gill, Senior Manager for Sustainable Finance at CDP. So to talk about the alphabet soup. I'm actually on the ISO Technical Working Group for the Financial Sector Transition Planning Standard. So I want to learn from all of you and your experiences. We've heard about the problem around, if you set the requirements too high, if you go beyond principles to a point where actually it's not implementable, that doesn't work. But we've also heard that we need to move beyond towards more ambition, towards something that's auditable, something that can be used by regulators, that actually needs something that can be held to account. How do we tread that line when we're talking about building a standard by consensus, when we're talking about common but differentiated responsibilities? How do we toe that in a productive way to end up with something that's usable, that builds trust, and that regulators can ultimately grow those stronger fangs with?
A brilliant question, a very pertinent question. I'll start with you, Daniel, from the standard setter perspective, and then maybe Valentina coming on the sort of the financial transition perspective.
I was thinking of the microphone. Well, I think that's something on the process, and usually when you follow that process that's been established and that's been proved for many, many years, the standardization process of that consensus and the representation from the different countries, if you have the broader range of stakeholders participating in there, you will find that document that has the possibility to be implemented, because if you set the standard so high, no one will follow that. But if you say that so low, it wouldn't have that credibility. And that's, I think that's the beauty of the process, of the standards development process, in which you have different stakeholders representing different interests. You have the industry, you have the organizations, you have the financial institutions, you have the NGOs, you have everyone there participating, and they will not allow a document that will be so low. But also the organizations that will be implementing will be making the group conscious of how high that would be. There's also a need for a level of ambition in the process, of course, usually you have that from different parts of the stakeholders. So I think the process, it's been like that, it's been useful, but also the process being revised every time. So every time we find something that would be improving that, then it will come to the process. But generally, trusting the process is the right way to find what you were mentioning.
And could I bring you in, Valentina, on the financial perspective, and then finally Matilda on the policymaker aspect of the question?
Yeah, so perhaps 2 quick points. There's no quick fix, that's obvious, but I think embracing complexity and breaking it down by regions and sectors is one way we've tried to come up around the issue. So as I was saying, all sectors are not going to decarbonize at the same rate in different regions. So if you have a sectoral specific guidance or recommendations, then actually nuance it a little bit more. So that's perhaps one, the granularity aspect of it. And I guess another example could be the materiality side. So just bring the materiality aspect into consideration in terms of what you're going to do, what you're going to prioritize. So one clear example on that is the Scope 3, for example, mandates. So instead of one size fits all Scope 3 for everyone, perhaps a materiality aspect in that case. So I guess climate is a complex, all-encompassing umbrella term. So it would be hard to bring one answer to that. But I guess it's just embracing nuance and embracing complexity would be the one thing.
And lastly from you, Matilda, on the policymaker side.
Maybe two additional points. What we do when we are negotiating a standard at the OECD, as I said, very often we consider this is aspirational. That means to make sure that we don't end up at the minimum common denominator level. So some countries would know that they would not be in a position to be fully compliant with the standard, but they would aspire to become. And also we have the concept of proportionality, so that recognizing in the drafting of the standard that you cannot expect, for example, SMEs to do as much as multinational organizations, etc. So you have these two concepts that help us to, even if we are consensus-based, not ending up too low.
Absolutely.
Just one thing that I should have mentioned that has been useful for us is actually having ranks of recommendations, so core recommendations and perhaps advanced recommendations, which can be another way to sort of, this is best practice and this is best practice. When you have the resources and
that was a great question to get our panel fired up there. I think I saw some other hands earlier. Can I turn back to the audience for any more questions for our panel? Don't be shy, I definitely saw some other hands. There we go, front row.
Eugene Montoya from Waterfront Alliance. We're a coastal resilience NGO. We're just starting to intersect a bit more with the carbon markets as well. My question, I think, has sort of been answered, but maybe you could still give a little light on it. It's this fine balance between advocacy and measurement. Standards really, historically were created to give people a common unit of analysis, a way to transact, to create efficiency in commerce and culture. But now this net zero standard, or all net zero standards, transition plans, they have a lot of other, directional push that they're putting onto reporting entities, and then of course the real economy and the financial intermediaries. So there's a lot more, I guess, governance coming through it in terms of trying to move towards dealing with the sources of anthropogenic emissions. And so how do you neutralize that a little bit more and get it back to its original origin, which is, this is a way to measure, understand, to do cost benefit, to do risk return. How do you take that piece out to make it more palpable for people who are reluctant?
So what I heard from that question is, how can we make sure standards are really getting to the heart of what's needed for net zero, the decision-ready information, making it clear, almost cutting through all the noise and discourse around net zero, making it clear what's needed to be done? Great, fantastic. I'll start first with you, Daniel, on that question about how do we make sure it's clear and actionable for organizations, particularly those who are struggling to get on their pathway to net zero. And then I'd love to bring you in, Alex, from the business perspective, as I imagine that's something you hear all the time from your members.
Well, one of the things in the standard is that it has to be applicable, and the requirements have to be written in a way that can be verified or checked that it's being clear in that. So that's something in the drafting of the document. We need to pay attention to how we are drafting that can be applicable and that can be verifiable. But the other part also, and Matilda mentioned about the best practices and the recommendation. And we could also in the document include recommendations. And many documents they have the requirement and what you can have to do. But also you can include some recommendations, go further, do this. And also we have the annexes that can also get the organizations to move to the next level, to try to go further and not just, and in that way you have a measurable document with clear requirements, but you can also start introducing aspirational things, go this way, try to go there. Because as I was mentioning in the first intervention, it gets revised, the document gets revised. So something that could be as aspirational in this version of the document, once it's been implemented in the next revision, that would become a requirement again, and you are raising the bar. And that's a good way also to move organizations in a process, not just getting the bar so high that they cannot get there. You put something, you start getting those aspirational things and recommendations or annexes and go.
I'm bringing you in, Alex, from the business perspective on that question.
Well, that's a second great question, so I love it. Yeah? So I love the first one on balancing ambition, feasibility to implement, and now how much advocacy should you play in? So I would reply of saying, look, like what is the purpose on the respective standards that we are talking about? Like what does it really mean to achieve? Is it a mean to give transparency first and foremost? Then yes, there should be no advocacy in it. It should, like if we are now talking about the time is now, like we see here in the standards pavilion. So if it's on acting based on science, so then I would say let's put it on science. And if a net zero standard, like in these examples, if it also have a target setting component, this should be definitely be built on, well, like on the multi-stakeholder process as ISO is running, but then also build it on the science that is needed. And some may call it it's advocacy, others may call it, yeah, this is what is needed now. In whatever is done, it should be very transparent of how assumptions got into it. So I think the transparency of the overall process and reading how it got developed and what are the ingoing assumptions that led to it are probably most critical. And this sounds, I don't know, probably much easier than it is at the end as we know it, especially if you take it to sectorial lenses and what is feasible. So yes, is it just a balance between a feasibility to implement and what is needed? Or is there like a tier system so that companies can get in and then get stronger and demonstrate progress? But there's another element, right, of what is the MRE, so the measurements, reporting and verification element to see how are companies then going along. So that also needs much more transparency as we have it. But I know at the end of the day, there are coming many different perspectives in. And I strongly believe they need to be transparently on the table. What role are voluntary carbon markets playing a role? If yes, which ones, at what stage can they be implemented, at what stage can they be taken in? So if this is not transparent, yeah, then you start to mistrust a process, and then you also may start to mistrust, okay, what is its standard doing? So I think that's some of the thoughts that I feel are much needed.
Any other questions?
Hi, Tracy Wyman with SBTI. I'm really interested in the panelists' opinion on, in a world where the international standard system is rolling out quickly, and we really applaud it, a net zero standard, what role in the future do voluntary standards have?
Thank you very much. I imagine lots of our panelists have views on this. As you mentioned SBTI earlier, Alex, would you like to start? And then maybe Daniel, I'll come on to you. And we've been given the 5-minute warning, so we'll see how many we can fit in. But Alex, I'll start with you.
I'm not sure, Tracy, if I've fully got the question, perhaps, because like here's what role are voluntary standards playing in what?
The sort of voluntary initiatives.
Because so like getting from voluntary initiatives to more standardizations like ISO, getting into like regulatory disclosure, right? So I would say it is like we would not be there where we are if we would not have the success of SBTI. So I think all the actions, on many of the actions, where companies signed up early to voluntary initiatives such as SBTI, got investments unlocked in companies. So if now like an international standard such as ISO Net Zero can build on that success and take it further and use the muscles that ISO would have, would probably take it even further. And if then new ideas are coming in from another voluntary initiatives, that should also be probably captured. Really, it's like a maturity model of saying, yes, here are 1,000 of companies that signed up to SBTI. How do we get more? But then it's also the question, how do we get it more specific? So we did not talk, because I know one of the biggest challenges is how do we really make it sector specific? So whose work is it then to really ensure that across, and at WBCSD we host so many industry, and I know some are happy, some are complaining, some are saying this doesn't work and there's not sufficient expertise. I don't even know if ISO would be able to do that, or if it's then more on a sectorial level, because they are also like sectorial standard organization who would then really make it much more precise. But as a front runner, voluntary initiatives, I would definitely say are much needed, so that companies can really get the ball moving.
And coming to you, Daniel, to build on that question from Tracy at SBTI, you are convening this huge international process, and as we've already noted on the panel, lots of these voluntary initiatives who've done a lot of this work, such as SBTI, WBCSD, and others, are joining ISO in order to participate in this process. Can you give your reflections on this point, on this question of the importance of these voluntary initiatives building momentum in the market to make some of the international process that you're convening possible?
Yeah, it's been very useful to have different organizations participating. SBTI has been there in the process, and the comments we received from SBTI and from WBCSD, they've been really useful for the document. The work that those voluntary initiatives create in building that momentum and in building on the document has been very important. And we would like to have that into the document. In fact, it's not, and I think that's a very interesting process we are having right now, in which it's not only ISO members participating, but also we have many liaison organizations participating from those voluntary initiatives, bringing their knowledge and their experience to the document. And also thinking about in the future, what would happen. Probably some of these voluntary initiatives will not be so voluntary, not necessarily because the regulation is requiring for that, but also the market start requiring that. And we have something that we have found also in our country, just thinking about the national standardization process, is that when we develop documents and when we develop standards, their purpose is to help the public policies to be implemented. Some can be implemented in a voluntary basis, and the regulation is not required, because you have these voluntary initiatives that will not require that regulation. But also, if regulation needs to get something to be regulated, they have a document that is consensus-based, that is being used for a broad range of stakeholders, and it would be made easier to get that regulation in place and be applied. Because in the end, when you have the regulation, but no one is doing anything and just ignoring that regulation, that can become complicated, particularly for countries where control is not that strong. But when you have these voluntary initiatives, that become easier. That's what I think about what would happen in the future with that.
And I think that's a really exciting note to sort of bring our Q&A session to a close on, that actually there is a huge amount of momentum, there's a huge amount of work that's been done that makes international processes like this even feasible to attempt, and that there's a huge amount of lessons learned, insights such as those you've shared, Valentina, from the IIGCC's work in moving investors and building confidence to help unlock capital, from you, Matilda, on the OECD's work on building buy-in and consensus consensus from your members on principle-based policies and processes to help governments go faster, and Alex, the huge amount of momentum and convening power that businesses have on climate action to urge the market to move faster that the WBCSD has built. So I think this is a positive story that we can look at here of different parts of the governance ecosystem starting to work hand in hand to make processes like the ones we've discussed today possible. So I want to invite you all to join us at our reception that is beginning now. I can see some things being laid out. I also want, before you go and grab a well-earned refreshment, and for those of you online who can open your browser easily, we have a QR code on screen, which I'd really encourage all of you to scan before you go and get a drink. In this QR code, you will see a link to the ISO website that Daniel referred to earlier. As a reminder, the ISO system is your system. It is not owned by any one institution or country or organization. It is a system for you to use. You can join your national standards body today by finding your country's national standards body on that link and emailing them to apply to join your National Climate Standards Committee. To help you learn more about why this is worth your time and why you should care, you'll also see other links included, such as our apolitical article on how to scale climate governance globally, which will speak to the role of quality infrastructure that Matilda was alluding to earlier. So please do peruse our resources. If you've got any questions about how to get involved or any concerns you have, come and talk to us and enjoy the reception this evening. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you.